Sarah Mitchell gripped the armrest of the military transport as it touched down on the runway at Nellis Air Force Base. The aircraft's wheels hit the tarmac with a bounce that made her stomach flip, a sensation she'd experienced thousands of times over her 12-year career, yet something about this landing felt different. This wasn't just another job change. This was stepping into a world she'd only observed from a distance, a realm where ordinary rules seemed not to apply. She pressed her forehead against the small window, watching the Nevada landscape roll past in shades of tan and rust. The desert stretched endlessly, brutal and beautiful in its emptiness. Somewhere on this base were the men and women who piloted the F-22 Raptor, the most advanced fighter jet in the world. For most of her career, Sarah had served wealthy businessmen, celebrities, and politicians, people accustomed to comfort and deference. But this was different. These pilots lived in a stratosphere of excellence that transcended civilian success. The cabin depressurized with a soft hiss. Sarah stood, smoothing her new uniform, charcoal gray instead of the navy she'd worn for the past decade. The fit felt slightly unfamiliar, like stepping into someone else's skin. She'd requested this transfer after her daughter started college, after realizing that her life had become too predictable. 12 years of the same routes, the same routines, the same scripts delivered to passengers who rarely listened. She wanted something with meaning, something that mattered beyond ensuring passengers had sufficient ice in their drinks. Her supervisor at commercial airlines had tried to talk her out of it. "You're making a mistake," Richard had warned, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd never taken a real risk. "Military flying isn't glamorous, Sarah. It's unglamorous work, frankly. You'll be serving men and women whose minds are always somewhere else. Strategic problems, equipment failures lives at stake." Sarah had listened politely and booked the next flight to Nevada anyway. As she gathered her luggage from the overhead compartment, her hands trembled slightly. Nervousness or excitement? Probably both. She was 52 years old, reinventing herself on a military base where the average pilot was 35 and possessed a level of confidence that came from mastering machines that cost more than small countries. What was she thinking? The aircraft door opened, and the heat hit her like a physical force. The Nevada sun wasn't like the sun anywhere else. It didn't warm you, it attacked you. Sarah descended the stairs slowly, her roller bag bumping against her leg, and immediately felt sweat beginning to bead on her forehead. She hadn't even made it to the operations building, and she was already regretting the decision to arrive in full uniform. The tarmac stretched before her like a runway that extended to the horizon. In the distance, she could see the distinctive silhouettes of fighter jets lined up on the flight line, their sleek frames catching the afternoon sunlight. Some were F-22s, she was certain of that. She'd spent the last month studying military aircraft, absorbing technical specifications, learning the language of aviation in a way she'd never bothered to do before. It was a small act of respect, preparation for a world she was entering as a newcomer. "Ms. Mitchell," a man in flight suit approached her, hand extended. He had the squared shoulders and precise movements of someone accustomed to authority. "Major Reynolds, welcome to Nellis." Sarah shook his hand, nodding the calluses on his palms, the way his eyes assessed her in a single sweep, professional, assessing, not unkind. "Thank you, Major. I'm honored to be here." "We'll see if you say that after your first week," he said, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Come on, let's get you out of this heat before you melt. Your uniform's only going to get heavier once you've sweated through it." They walked toward the operations building, and Sarah found herself suddenly hyper-aware of every detail. The sound of aircraft engines in the distance, a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through her chest, the smell of jet fuel, sharp and chemical, the sight of military personnel moving with purposeful strides, everyone seemingly knowing exactly where they were going and why. There was an efficiency here, a sense of direction that was absent in civilian airports. "First assignment is tomorrow," Major Reynolds said as they entered the blessed coolness of the building. "Flight 447. We're transporting a pilot squadron to an international aviation summit in Geneva. The crew is top tier, some of the best we have. You'll be working with Colonel James Hartwell as senior pilot. Good man. Former test pilot, multiple combat tour, about as close to the stereotype of a fighter pilot as you can get without it becoming absurd. Sarah's breath caught slightly. Test pilot. She'd read about test pilots during her research, the elite of the elite, the ones who didn't just fly the most advanced aircraft but pushed them to their limits and beyond. The ones who understood their planes at a level that bordered on intimate. "You nervous?" Reynolds asked, studying her face with an expression that suggested he already knew the answer. "Terrified," Sarah admitted, "but in a good way. I've spent 12 years being competent at a job that stopped challenging me 6 years ago. I wanted to feel something again." Reynolds nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the attitude you need. These guys, the pilots, they're remarkable people, but they're also human. They need someone on their crew who's steady, who understands that at 30,000 feet, calm matters more than charm. Can you be that person?" "Yes," Sarah said, and she meant it. "Good, because tomorrow morning you board that flight at 800, and from that moment until we land in Geneva, you're not just a flight attendant. You're part of an operation that matters. These men and women you'll be serving, some of them will be flying combat missions within the month. The levity, the professionalism, the normality you provide, it matters more than you might think." That night in her small on-base apartment, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay in the darkness, listening to the distant sound of jets taking off and landing, a constant reminder that she was now living in a world of motion and purpose. She thought about her ex-husband, who'd always complained that she never took risks, that she played it safe. Well, she'd taken a risk now. She pulled out her phone and looked up the roster for Flight 447. The names were unfamiliar, except for one, Colonel James Hartwell. The name of a man who'd apparently broken multiple records as a test pilot. The man who would be flying tomorrow while she served coffee and beverages in the cabin behind him. Sarah set her alarm for 5:30 and finally closed her eyes, knowing that tomorrow, her entire life would change in ways she couldn't yet imagine. Sarah arrived at the Flight Operations Center at 6:45, 45 minutes before her scheduled departure. Her uniform was crisp, her hair pulled back in a neat bun, her shoes polished until they reflected the fluorescent lights overhead. She'd woken at 500, unable to sleep past that point despite lying awake most of the night. The anxiety had transformed into adrenaline, focused, purposeful, almost electric in her veins. The operations center buzzed with quiet activity. Military personnel moved through the corridors with the kind of casual precision that came from doing the same things repeatedly, efficiently, without drama. Sarah checked the flight manifest 3 times, though she'd already memorized every detail. Flight 447, departing 800 for Geneva, transporting 8 pilots, 2 co-pilots, and a support crew of 5. Destination: the International Aviation Summit, a gathering of the world's elite aviation experts and test pilots. She made her way to the aircraft, a military transport plane, sleek and serious, lacking the commercial polish of the civilian jets she'd served on for the past 12 years. There was something almost intimidating about it, the way it sat on the tarmac like a predator at rest. This wasn't designed for comfort, it was designed for purpose. Inside, Sarah began her pre-flight preparations with meticulous attention. She checked the galley supplies, ensured all emergency equipment was in place, reviewed the safety protocols one more time. Her hands moved through the motions with practiced efficiency, but her mind kept circling back to one question: would she measure up? These weren't ordinary passengers. These were men and women who lived in an environment where mistakes could be fatal, where excellence wasn't aspirational but mandatory. "You're early." Sarah turned to find a man entering the cabin. He was tall, perhaps 6'2", with the kind of presence that seemed to fill available space. His flight suit bore the insignia of a colonel, and his eyes held the particular sharpness she'd come to understand indicated someone who saw more than most people. This had to be Colonel James Hartwell. "Just getting oriented, sir," Sarah said, straightening slightly. "Making sure everything is perfect for your departure." Hartwell studied her for a moment, and Sarah found herself fighting the urge to squirm under that assessment. "You're the new flight attendant," he said. It wasn't a question. "Mitchell, right?" "Yes, sir. Sarah Mitchell, 12 years commercial aviation, recently transferred to this assignment." She kept her voice steady, professional, the way she'd practiced. "Major Reynolds speaks highly of you," Hartwell said. "Said you're steady under pressure and don't panic easily. We like that in crew members." "Thank you, sir. I take that as high praise from Major Reynolds." Hartwell smiled slightly, not a warm smile exactly, but a recognition of something. "Well, let's see if you maintain that composure at altitude with 8 of the most demanding passengers you'll ever serve." He extended his hand. "James Hartwell, welcome to the squadron." They shook hands, and Sarah felt the strength in his grip, the calluses accumulated from years of operating complex machinery. This was a man who did things, who lived in an environment where hesitation could be fatal. Over the next hour, the rest of the crew began arriving. There was Captain Marcus "Viper" Chen, a younger pilot with an almost boyish enthusiasm that seemed incongruous with his deadly competence. There was Major Sarah "Stryker" Williams, one of only a handful of female F-22 pilots in the program, who assessed Sarah with a glance that suggested she was cataloging whether Sarah would be capable of handling the demands of this mission. There was Captain Jake "Reaper" Morrison, who carried himself with the kind of casual confidence that came from knowing exactly how good you were. Sarah learned their call signs, memorized their preferences, made notes about who took coffee black and who preferred tea. It was her job to anticipate needs, to maintain the kind of seamless service that made people forget they were being served. In the civilian world, she'd been excellent at this. But the civilian world was forgiving. This world, she sensed, was not. At 7:55, Major Reynolds appeared in the cabin. "5 minutes, everyone. Let's do final checks." Sarah moved through the cabin, checking seatbelts, reviewing safety information once more, positioning herself in the forward galley where she could observe the cockpit. Her heart was beating faster now, adrenaline mixing with genuine excitement. In 5 minutes, she would be airborne with the most elite pilots in the United States military. The engines powered up with a deep rumble that seemed to vibrate through her bones. The aircraft began to taxi toward the runway, and Sarah found herself gripping the edge of the counter slightly. This was real. This was happening. As they accelerated down the runway, Sarah moved through the cabin performing the required safety briefing. She'd given this briefing thousands of times, but today it felt different. Today, the people listening to her weren't businessmen checking their phones or tourists dozing in their seats. Today, they were warriors preparing for a mission, and they were paying attention. She reached the final passenger and began the closing statement. "This is Flight 447. We're pleased to have you aboard today. I'm your lead cabin attendant, Phoenix." She paused, continuing with the standard closing before moving toward the cockpit to confirm that the safety briefing was complete. But something had changed in the cabin. The silence hit her first, not the normal silence of passengers settling in for flight, but something different, something electric and tense. Sarah turned back to look at the cabin, and what she saw made her freeze. Every pilot had turned to face her, 8 pairs of eyes locked on her position. Colonel Hartwell's expression had changed from genial to something else entirely, something that resembled shock mixed with something she couldn't quite identify. Disbelief, perhaps, or fear. Captain Chen's coffee cup had frozen halfway to his lips. Major Williams was leaning forward slightly, her eyes narrowed in concentration, as if she was trying to solve a puzzle. Captain Morrison had gone absolutely still, his entire body tense like a coiled spring. Sarah felt her stomach drop. What had she done? What had she said? Colonel Hartwell stood up, moving toward the cockpit with a purposefulness that suggested something was urgently wrong. As he passed, She heard him murmur something to Captain Chen, who grabbed a folder from the seat beside him. The other pilots began conferring in low voices, urgent and intense. Through the partially open cockpit door, Sarah heard Hartwell's voice, tight and controlled. "Get me the full passenger manifest, cross-reference the crew roster, and pull up the classified files from 1997. Sarah stood frozen in the galley, her heart hammering against her ribs. In the space of a single word, a call sign that meant nothing to her, everything had changed. The atmosphere in the cabin had transformed from casual professionalism to something far more charged, something that suggested she had just activated something she didn't understand. She'd spoken once, and the F-22 pilots had frozen. The aircraft climbed steadily toward cruising altitude, and Sarah felt as though she were ascending into a nightmare rather than the sky. Something had fundamentally shifted in the atmosphere, a tectonic plate of tension that had moved beneath the surface of normalcy. The pilots were no longer talking casually or reviewing flight plans. Instead, they'd clustered near the cockpit, their voices dropped to urgent whispers that Sarah could almost hear but not quite decipher. She stood in the galley, ostensibly checking supplies, but her attention was entirely focused on the voices drifting from the front of the cabin. Every instinct told her to approach them, to ask what was wrong, to offer some explanation for whatever she'd inadvertently done. But something else, a deeper instinct rooted in self-preservation, kept her frozen in place. "It's impossible," Captain Chen's voice came through clearly, pitched just slightly too loud despite the attempt at discretion. "There's no way. We confirmed she was gone, off the grid completely." "Maybe she came back," Captain Morrison responded, his tone carrying something between fear and awe. "Maybe she re-entered the service under a different—" "She would never," Major Williams cut in sharply. "Not after what happened. Her file was sealed for a reason." Sarah's pulse quickened. A file, sealed. They were talking about a file, and somehow they believed it was connected to her, but that made no sense. She'd been a civilian flight attendant for 12 years. What file could possibly concern them? Colonel Hartwell's voice came next, lower and more controlled than the others, which somehow made it more frightening. "Pull up the 1997 database. I want everything on Major Amanda Cross. Every test score, every evaluation, every classified notation. And get me the original file on the call sign assignment protocol from that year." Call sign assignment protocol. Sarah's hand trembled as she reached for a bottle of water, trying to maintain the appearance of normalcy. Her call sign. They were investigating her call sign. But why would a call sign matter so much that it would cause this kind of reaction? She'd been assigned the call sign Phoenix by a personnel officer during her military family briefing when she'd first transferred to this division. It was standard procedure. All military crew members received call signs based on various criteria: heritage, family military history, performance metrics. In her case, the officer had mentioned her father's service record, the family aviation tradition. Phoenix had seemed like a fitting choice, a bird associated with rebirth, rising again. But apparently, Phoenix meant something else entirely, something classified, something that had been sealed away in 1997. Sarah became acutely aware of how isolated she was. At 35,000 feet, there was nowhere to go, no escape from whatever this situation was becoming. She was locked in a metal tube with 8 pilots and support crew who were currently treating her as if she were either an imposter or a ghost. She decided to make coffee. It was something to do, something normal, something that would give her a purpose and justify her remaining in the galley. As she prepared the brewing station, she concentrated on the sounds around her, trying to piece together the puzzle from the fragmented whispers. Perfect simulation scores. Disappeared in 98. Classified operations. Reassignment or extraction. No record of civilian employment. That last fragment made Sarah's stomach clench. No record of civilian employment. They were checking her background. They were investigating whether she was who she claimed to be. Nearly an hour passed with the pilots maintaining their conspiratorial huddle. Sarah served drinks mechanically, her smile frozen on her face, her hands steady despite the panic that was rising in her chest like floodwater. She'd done nothing wrong. She knew that logically, and yet something about her very identity, or more specifically, her call sign, had triggered a response that suggested she'd either committed some crime or was someone other than who she believed herself to be. Captain Chen had taken a seat near the galley, a folder in his lap. Sarah caught glimpses of official-looking documents, photographs, classification markings. He was reading something intently, occasionally glancing back at her, then returning to the pages with increased focus. Finally, Colonel Hartwell appeared in the aisle beside her. This was the moment Sarah had been dreading and anticipating simultaneously. Up close, his expression was even more unsettling than she'd imagined. It combined confusion, suspicion, and something that might have been recognition, as if he was looking at someone he'd expected to never see again. "Ms. Mitchell," he said quietly, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me completely honestly." Sarah's throat went dry. "Of course, Colonel, whatever you need." "Your call sign, Phoenix, where did it come from? Who assigned it to you?" Sarah paused, searching her memory. "A personnel officer during my initial briefing. Major. I think it was Major Caldwell. He explained that it was based on my father's service history and the aviation tradition in my family. Why? Did I do something wrong?" Hartwell's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "Your father, what was his name?" "David Mitchell. He served in the Air Force from 1975 to 1998. Why does this matter, Colonel?" For a moment, Hartwell looked almost unsteady on his feet. He placed a hand against the armrest of a nearby seat to steady himself. "I need your full credentials, Mitchell. Service records, family documentation, employment history, everything, for security purposes." The words were polite, but the tone was anything but. This wasn't a routine request. This was an interrogation dressed in military protocol. "Of course," Sarah said, her voice smaller than she intended. "I have my personnel file in my carry-on. I can retrieve it immediately." "Do that," Hartwell said. "Bring it to the cockpit. And Mitchell," he paused, studying her face as if seeing something in her features that troubled him deeply. "Don't discuss this with anyone. Not the other crew members, not the pilots. Keep to yourself until we land. Can you do that?" Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady if she spoke. As Hartwell returned to the cockpit, Sarah pulled her carry-on from the overhead bin with shaking hands. She opened it, found her personnel folder, and made her way to the front of the aircraft. But as she walked, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was stepping across a threshold into a world she didn't understand, a world where her identity was somehow contested, where a simple call sign had the power to unmake her. The cockpit door closed behind her, and the whispers began again, urgent, desperate whispers about someone named Amanda Cross, about sealed files and disappeared records, about a woman who supposedly didn't exist anymore. The cockpit was smaller than Sarah had expected, and it smelled of coffee, electronics, and something metallic that she couldn't quite identify. Colonel Hartwell sat in the pilot's seat, a folder open on his lap. Several of Sarah's documents were spread across the center console, her personnel file, her identification, her father's service records. Captain Chen sat in the co-pilot's seat, his expression grave. "Sit," Hartwell instructed, gesturing to a jump seat behind the pilots. His voice was gentler now than it had been in the cabin, but that almost made it worse. Gentleness suggested pity, and Sarah didn't want pity. She wanted answers. "I don't understand what's happening," Sarah said quietly, settling into the seat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "What did I do? Is there something wrong with my call sign assignment?" Hartwell and Chen exchanged a look, a long, weighted glance that seemed to communicate volumes without words. Finally, Hartwell turned to face her directly, and Sarah saw something shift in his expression. He'd made a decision about how to proceed. "Sarah, I'm about to tell you something that's been classified for nearly 30 years. What I'm about to share is not something I can legally share with you, but given the circumstances, I believe you have a right to know. Understand?" Sarah nodded, unable to speak. "In 1995, Hartwell began, his voice taking on the cadence of someone recounting a story he'd told only to himself for many years. There was a test pilot in the F-22 program, the only female test pilot in that program at that time. Her name was Major Amanda Cross. Her call sign was Phoenix." Sarah's breath caught audibly. Phoenix, her call sign, the same call sign. "Amanda Cross was extraordinary," Hartwell continued. "I'm not exaggerating when I say she was the most talented pilot I've ever flown with, and I've flown with some of the best. She had perfect instincts, perfect scores on every simulation, perfect technique. She was pushing the F-22 to limits that male pilots hadn't reached. She was rewriting what was possible for the aircraft." Chen leaned forward slightly. Everyone knew her name, not because she was a woman, though that was remarkable, but because she was that good. There was talk of her becoming the first female fighter pilot in active combat rotation. She was breaking barriers that everyone thought were immovable. "What happened to her?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Hartwell's jaw tightened. "That's where it gets complicated. In 1997, Amanda was reassigned. Officially, she left the program for family reasons. Her records were sealed, not just classified, sealed. That means even those of us with top-level security clearance couldn't access the details. We got rumors, speculation, theories. Some people said she'd been recruited for black ops work, covert operations that required her skills. Others said she'd left the military entirely because of pressure she couldn't handle. A few people whispered that something had happened, that she was forced out." "And no one ever found out?" Sarah asked. "No one we could talk to," Chen said. "Her file just disappeared into the classified system. She became a ghost story. Pilots would talk about her, the legendary Amanda Cross, the one who got away before she could reach her full potential. 28 years old when she vanished from the program. No one's seen or heard from her since." Sarah felt the room tilting slightly. "But what does this have to do with me? I'm not Amanda Cross. I'm Sarah Mitchell. I've been a civilian flight attendant for 12 years. I've never been a test pilot. I don't have any connection to—" "Your call sign," Hartwell interrupted gently. "Phoenix, that's Amanda Cross's call sign, the exact same call sign." "But that's a coincidence," Sarah said, hearing the desperation in her own voice. "Call signs are assigned based on specific criteria," Hartwell finished. "And we've looked at the assignment protocol from when you received yours. Major Caldwell assigned it based on your father's service record. Your father, David Mitchell, who served from 1975 to 1998. The year hung in the air between them. 1998, the year after Amanda Cross disappeared." "I don't understand," Sarah said, but even as she said it, she was beginning to understand. The way the pieces were aligning, the coincidences that weren't coincidences at all. "We don't either," Hartwell admitted. "That's what frightens us, because the odds of someone else receiving that exact call sign years after Amanda Cross disappeared, years after her file was sealed and her name was effectively erased from the system, those odds are astronomical. Either this is the most remarkable coincidence in military history, or something else is happening." "What do you mean, something else?" Sarah asked. "We mean," Chen said carefully, "that either you're Amanda Cross and you've somehow returned to the military under an assumed identity, or someone deliberately assigned you that call sign knowing exactly what they were doing. Someone with access to classified information. Someone who knew what Cross's call sign meant." Sarah felt tears pricking her eyes. "That's insane. My father was just an Air Force pilot. He wasn't involved in any black ops or classified programs. He was a transport pilot, not a—" She stopped, a memory surfacing unexpectedly. Wait, in 1997 and 1998 my father had a long-term assignment. He wouldn't talk about it. I remember my mother asking him about it and he said it was classified. He said he couldn't discuss it and she should stop asking questions. Hartwell and Chen both went very still. Do you remember anything else about that assignment? Hartwell asked, his voice urgent now. Anything at all, where he was stationed, who he was working with? Sarah closed her eyes, reaching back into childhood memories, trying to grasp something that had seemed unimportant at the time. There was a woman. I remember because my mother was jealous. She didn't think anything was happening, but she was concerned because my father wouldn't talk about her. He would take calls at strange hours, and my mother overheard him say the name once. It was Amanda. I remember because it was unusual. My father wasn't the type to have close working relationships with women. It made my mother suspicious. Amanda, Chen repeated softly. If your father was working with Amanda Cross during her final months in the program, Hartwell said slowly, he might have been involved in something that the military needed to keep quiet, something that required discretion, careful handling. You're saying my father might have known Amanda Cross, Sarah asked, that he might have been assigned to help her with something. I'm saying, Hartwell replied, that your father may have been one of the few people who knew exactly what happened to her. And if that's true, if he knew something that important, then the fact that his daughter received Amanda Cross's call sign years later, that's not random. That's either a message or a warning or something we don't have the framework to understand. Sarah felt as if the floor beneath her had become unstable. Her entire life, everything she believed about her identity and her family, was suddenly cast into shadow. Her father had passed away 5 years ago, quietly, of a heart attack. He'd never mentioned any connection to Amanda Cross. He'd never told her about secret assignments or classified work. What are you going to do? She asked Hartwell. That, he said carefully, is the question we've all been asking ourselves for the past hour. We're going to find out exactly what your father knew, what he was involved in, and why he, or someone, decided his daughter should carry Amanda Cross's call sign. And we're going to do it very carefully, because if we're right about this, someone went to great lengths to keep this secret. The aircraft landed in Geneva at 14:30 local time, and Sarah was immediately escorted away from the other crew members. A military attaché named Agent Rodriguez, his dark suit and professional demeanor marking him as intelligence rather than regular personnel, met her at the private terminal. No explanations were offered, only instructions. She was to remain available for questioning. She was not to contact anyone without permission, and she was not to discuss the situation with family or friends. Sarah had spent the flight from Nevada to Switzerland in a state of suspended animation. She'd stayed in the crew quarters, avoiding everyone, reading the same pages of a book without comprehending the words. The weight of Hartwell's revelation pressed down on her like gravity increasing. Somewhere in this aircraft had been a woman named Amanda Cross, a legendary pilot, and her father had somehow been connected to that woman's disappearance. The hotel room they assigned her was luxurious but felt like a cage. Through the windows, she could see the Geneva skyline, the orderly precision of Swiss architecture, everything clean and normal and impossibly distant from the chaos unfolding in her life. She sat on the bed and called her sister, Janet. "Sarah, where are you?" Janet's voice came through with the particular concern of someone who'd been worried for hours. "Geneva, I'm on an assignment. Janet, I need to ask you something about Dad." Silence on the other end. Not the silence of someone gathering thoughts, but the silence of someone who'd been caught off guard, who knew immediately what the question was about. "Janet." "I can't talk about that," Janet said finally, her voice low. "Sarah, don't ask me about that. Not over the phone, not ever." Sarah felt her chest constrict. "You know something about Dad's assignment in 1997 and 1998. "I said I can't talk about it," Janet repeated, more urgently this time. "Sarah, I'm serious. This isn't something you should be investigating. Let it go." "I can't let it go," Sarah said. "There's something happening here, something classified, and Dad is connected to it somehow, and I need to understand." "You need to understand that some secrets exist for a reason," Janet interrupted. "Dad took an oath. He kept his word. And if the military is looking into this now, it's because they're trying to understand something they thought was resolved decades ago. My advice: cooperate, answer their questions truthfully, and do not push for information beyond what they voluntarily tell you." After Janet hung up, Sarah sat in the darkness of her hotel room, understanding blooming inside her like a poisonous flower. Her sister knew something. Her father had known something. And now the military was digging into a secret that had been buried for nearly 30 years. Back at Nellie's Air Force Base, agents from the Defense Intelligence Agency were doing exactly that, digging. They accessed David Mitchell's personnel files, cross-referencing them with classified operations records from 1997 and 1998. They discovered that Mitchell had been attached to a special project designation, Phoenix Wing, a classified program involving F-22 development and pilot evaluation. The connection was so obvious, so perfectly aligned, that it could hardly be coincidence. Colonel Hartwell received a secured briefing in a SCIF, a sensitive compartmented information facility, where the walls prevented electronic surveillance. The documents he reviewed told a story that had been hidden for nearly 3 decades. Major Amanda Cross had been involved in an experimental program testing advanced combat integration systems. The program had been ahead of schedule, showing remarkable promise. But in early 1997, Cross had discovered something, a flaw in the aircraft systems, a vulnerability that could be catastrophic if exposed to hostile forces. She had wanted to report the flaw through official channels, but her commanding officers had discouraged her, arguing that reporting it would delay the F-22's deployment and trigger a massive re-evaluation process. Cross had refused to be silenced. She'd begun keeping detailed notes, documenting the flaw and the pressure she was receiving to ignore it. She'd reached out to someone she trusted within the organization, Captain David Mitchell, an experienced transport pilot with high-level security clearance and unquestionable integrity. Mitchell had listened to her evidence, understood the implications, and realized that Cross was right. The flaw was serious enough that ignoring it would violate every principle of military responsibility. Together, they had begun planning to report the issue through proper channels, but they had to do it carefully. If they went through the normal chain of command, they risked being shut down. They needed an outside contact, someone with authority to act. Then in June 1997, everything had changed. Cross and Mitchell's communications had been intercepted. Within days, Cross had been formally reassigned for personal reasons. Her file had been sealed, and David Mitchell had been reassigned to a transport division in the Pacific, far away from the aerospace programs and the people involved in the Phoenix Wing project. The flaw that Cross had discovered, it had been quietly fixed in 1999, attributed to a routine system upgrade. No investigation, no official acknowledgement, no public record of what had almost become a scandal. Sarah received a call from Agent Rodriguez on her 3rd day in Geneva. "Ms. Mitchell, we'd like to conduct a formal interview. Please come to the embassy at 1000 hours tomorrow." The embassy interview room was small and sterile, equipped with recording equipment. Rodriguez sat across from her, along with another agent, Captain Margaret Torres, whose expression suggested she had access to information Sarah didn't. "We've been reviewing your father's service record," Rodriguez began carefully. "Specifically, his assignment to the Phoenix Wing program in 1997. Sarah's heart began racing. "My sister said he couldn't talk about it." "Your sister was correct," Torres said. "Captain Mitchell was bound by security oaths that extended beyond his lifetime. However, his death in 2019 has placed his records under review. We've discovered that he was involved in a situation that concerned several senior military officials at the time. The woman, Sarah said, Amanda Cross, he knew her. Torres and Rodriguez exchanged a glance. Yes, Rodriguez said finally. He knew her. More importantly, he helped her. When she attempted to report serious concerns about the F-22 systems to civilian oversight committees, your father provided her with protected contacts and secure communication channels. Technically, this was a violation of his security clearance, but practically, your father was doing exactly what a man of integrity should do. What happened to her, Sarah asked, after they forced her out? That, Torres said, is what we're trying to determine. Her file contains references to a relocation program, but the details have been obscured. The fact that you, her daughter, has received her call sign suggests that someone with knowledge of this history deliberately placed you in a position where this connection would eventually be discovered. Sarah's world stopped. Her daughter, I'm not Amanda Cross's. We've reviewed your genetic records, Torres said gently. When you enlisted in your current position, you provided DNA samples as part of standard security protocols. We ran a comparison against archived samples from the Phoenix Wing program. Sarah, Amanda Cross is your biological mother. Your father, David Mitchell, was her partner. When Cross was forced to leave the program, she was given a choice: disappear quietly or face a lengthy investigation that would ruin her career. She chose to disappear. David Mitchell helped her relocate, helped her begin a new life. 3 years later, you were born. The room spun. Sarah gripped the edge of the table, her entire understanding of her identity shattering like glass. This is impossible, she whispered. My mother, the woman who raised me. Was your mother in every way that mattered, Torres said quietly. Your biological mother, Amanda Cross, signed away all parental rights as part of her agreement to disappear. She became someone else, somewhere else. But before she did, she made sure her daughter would carry a piece of her legacy. Your call sign wasn't random, Sarah. Your father ensured it. It was his way of honoring what she'd done, what she'd sacrificed. Sarah spent 2 days in a state of shock that bordered on catatonia. She moved through the hotel mechanically, eating food she didn't taste, showering without remembering doing so, staring out windows at a city that might as well have been on another planet. Everything she understood about herself had been fundamentally reordered. The woman who'd raised her, Mary Mitchell, whom she'd called mother for 52 years, was not her biological mother. The man who'd taught her to ride a bike, who'd shown her the constellations from their backyard, who'd died 5 years ago, he'd been keeping a monumental secret his entire life. And somewhere in the world was a woman named Amanda Cross, a legend, a test pilot, a woman who'd given up everything, including her own daughter, to do what she believed was right. On the morning of the 3rd day, Agent Rodriguez arrived at her hotel room with new instructions. We've located Dr. Amanda Cross. She's agreed to meet with you under controlled circumstances. Are you ready for that? Sarah wasn't sure if she was ready, but she understood that readiness was irrelevant. This meeting was going to happen. The only question was whether she would be present for it. The meeting was arranged at a secure facility outside Geneva, a nondescript building that could have been anything: a private clinic, a corporate office, a government installation. Sarah was driven there by Rodriguez, who maintained a professional silence throughout the journey. No preparing remarks, no advice, no warnings. Just the quiet presence of someone who understood the weight of what was about to occur. They were escorted to a private room with windows overlooking a garden. It was peaceful, deliberately chosen to be calming. Sarah stood by the window, her hands trembling despite her attempts to control them. She'd requested 15 minutes alone with Amanda before any official debriefing or discussion. Torres had agreed, surprising her. The door opened. Sarah didn't turn immediately. She couldn't. She was gathering the strength to face the woman who was simultaneously a stranger and the person she'd been biochemically created from. Sarah. She turned. The woman in the doorway was in her late 60s with dark hair streaked with silver pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore jeans and a cream-colored sweater, utterly ordinary, utterly unpretentious. But her eyes, Sarah recognized them immediately. They were her eyes. The same shape, the same color, the same particular way of focusing intently on whatever held her attention. "Dr. Cross," Sarah said, then immediately felt foolish. She should call her something else. "What did you call your biological mother?" Dr. Cross seemed absurdly formal. "Amanda is fine," the woman said quietly. She didn't approach Sarah, maintaining distance as if understanding that proximity might be too much. "I know this is overwhelming. I want you to know, before we say anything else, that I didn't expect to ever meet you. When I made the choice to give you up, I thought I was making a final choice. I thought I would spend my life wondering about you from a distance, and that would be my burden to bear." Sarah sat down, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. "Why did you do it? Why did you give me up?" Amanda moved to the chair across from her, still maintaining that careful distance. "Because your father and I couldn't run together. When I was forced out of the program, I was given two choices: cooperate and disappear completely, or face scrutiny that would destroy everything. If I'd tried to take you with me, if David and I had tried to run together, they would have tracked us. They would have destroyed both of us, and they would have destroyed the credibility of everything we were trying to expose about the F-22 systems." "But Dad didn't disappear," Sarah said. "He stayed. He married Mom and raised me." "Yes," Amanda said, and there was such sadness in her voice that Sarah felt tears prickling her eyes. "Because David realized that if he disappeared with me, it would confirm their worst fears about what we'd done, what we'd uncovered. If he stayed, if he lived a normal life and kept his silence, they would eventually relax their surveillance. They would accept that we weren't a threat. He could protect you better that way, by being in your life, than by abandoning everything to protect a secret." "That's not fair," Sarah said, anger suddenly flooding through her. "That's not fair to any of us. You should have told me. Dad should have told me. I had a right to know my own history, my own." "You had the right to safety," Amanda interrupted gently. "To a normal childhood, to a mother who could be present without constantly looking over her shoulder. Do you understand what my life has been like? 30 years of being someone else, of watching my own daughter grow up through photographs that your father risked his career to send me. Of seeing your accomplishments, your career as a flight attendant, your steady life, and knowing I couldn't be part of it." Sarah wiped her eyes angrily. "You could have chosen differently. You could have." "What?" Amanda asked. "Refused to disappear, fought the system. I was a woman in a male-dominated military program who just challenged her commanders about a critical safety issue. They owned me completely. The only power I had was the power to disappear. And when I did, I made sure that at least you would have the chance to become who you were meant to be." Sarah heard the truth in those words, and it was perhaps more devastating than anger would have been. This woman had sacrificed everything: her name, her identity, her career, her daughter, for principles, for integrity, for the belief that some things mattered more than personal happiness. "How?" Sarah asked quietly. "How did you survive that?" Amanda smiled, and in that smile Sarah saw herself. "I didn't, not really, not for a long time. I became someone else, Dr. Amanda Ford, an aerospace consultant. I worked in private aviation, helping develop safety systems. It wasn't the glamorous career I dreamed of, but it was honorable work. And slowly, over decades, I began to accept that the choice I'd made was the right one, even though it cost me everything." She leaned forward slightly. "But Sarah, I need you to understand something. When your father gave you that call sign, Phoenix, he wasn't just assigning you a designation. He was telling you who you are. Phoenix is a bird that rises from ashes. Your father was telling you that even though my life had burned to the ground, something beautiful could rise from those ashes. You." Sarah felt something break open inside her, some protective wall that had been holding her together. She began to cry, deep, gasping sobs that came from a place so fundamental it felt like her body was releasing 30 years of genetic memory, of inherited trauma, of a secret that had lived in her bones without her knowing. Amanda rose and moved to her, pulling her into an embrace that felt at once completely foreign and deeply familiar. She smelled like lavender and something else, something that Sarah's body recognized even if her mind didn't. "I'm sorry," Amanda whispered. "I'm so sorry that it took this long. I'm sorry for everything you've lost by finding out." "And I'm grateful," Sarah whispered back, understanding as she spoke it that both things were true. Grief and gratitude, loss and discovery, anger and love, they could coexist. They could be held in the same moment. Sarah returned to Nellie's Air Force Base 5 days after landing in Geneva. The news had already preceded her, not the classified details, but enough of the truth had been distributed through official military channels that the pilots understood something significant had occurred. Colonel Hartwell met her at operations, and his entire demeanor had shifted. "Welcome back, Mitchell," he said, extending his hand. The grip was warm, genuine, and carried an unspoken apology. "I owe you an explanation and an apology." They sat in Hartwell's office, a room lined with photographs of him with various aircraft and personnel. On one wall hung a single framed photograph of a woman in a flight suit, unmistakably Amanda Cross, young and radiant, standing in front of an F-22 with the paint scheme still wet. "We know the full story now," Hartwell said carefully. "The classified records have been reviewed and declassified to a level that allows me to discuss this with you. Your biological mother was a remarkable woman, a test pilot of extraordinary talent and uncompromising integrity. Your father was a man of similar character. What they did, what they sacrificed matters. It mattered then, and it matters now." "Why are you telling me this?" Sarah asked. "Because you deserve to know that your presence here, carrying that call sign, it's not a mistake or a coincidence. It's a legacy. And because the men and women under my command need to understand exactly who they're flying with." That afternoon, Hartwell called a mandatory briefing for all personnel assigned to Flight 447 and related operations. Sarah attended, sitting quietly in the back of the conference room, watching the pilots' faces as Hartwell explained, without revealing classified details, what Sarah's presence meant. "Major Amanda Cross was the finest test pilot this program ever produced," Hartwell told them. "She had the courage to stand for something when standing was dangerous. She made sacrifices that most of us will never understand. And through a series of circumstances that I'm not at liberty to fully explain, her biological daughter has joined this base as a crew member." The pilots looked at Sarah with new eyes. It wasn't hero worship exactly, though there was some of that. It was something more subtle and more profound: recognition. They understood that they were in the presence of someone connected to the mythology of their community, someone who carried inherited integrity. Captain Chen approached her after the briefing. "I apologize for the suspicion," he said quietly. "We thought you were either an imposter or something far more mysterious. We should have trusted our training, trusted that people are who they say they are." "You were doing your jobs," Sarah said. "You were protecting something valuable." "Yes," Chen agreed. "We were protecting the legacy of pilots like Amanda Cross. And now, it seems, we're protecting you, which feels like protecting her in some way." Major Sarah Williams, the female fighter pilot who'd assessed her so sharply during that first flight, sought her out in the pilot's lounge. "I want you to know something," Williams said. "I became a pilot because of Amanda Cross. I never met her, never knew the details of her story, but I heard the legends. The woman who wouldn't be silenced. The woman who chose integrity over convenience. That story changed my life. And now that I know you're her daughter, it feels like the circle is completing somehow." Over the following weeks, Sarah's role within the squadron subtly transformed. She was still a flight attendant, still performing the same duties, but she was now something more, a keeper of history, a bridge between past and future. The pilots who'd flown with Amanda Cross, and there were several, began sharing stories with her. stories about her mother that had never made it into official records. Hartwell told her about the time Amanda had manually overridden the F-22's computer systems during a test flight when she'd identified a glitch that the automated systems hadn't caught. She'd risked the aircraft and her own life to prove the problem existed. She'd been right, of course. Captain Morrison shared a memory of Amanda mentoring him when he was a young pilot struggling with confidence. She told me that being a pilot wasn't about being perfect. It was about being willing to recognize when something was wrong and having the courage to act on that knowledge. She saved my career, probably multiple times, by teaching me that. Sarah found herself spending hours listening to these stories, recording them in her memory, understanding her mother, not as a woman who'd abandoned her, but as a person of such profound commitment to principle that she'd been willing to sacrifice everything, including the life she desperately wanted, for what was right. One evening, Sarah was flying with Hartwell to an aviation conference in Los Angeles. As they were climbing to altitude, Hartwell called her up to the cockpit. "I want to show you something," he said, gesturing to the controls. "This is what your mother loved. This moment, the transition from earthbound to flight, the point where physics and human skill merge into something transcendent." Sarah looked out at the darkening horizon, at the earth falling away beneath them, at the infinite sky spreading before them like possibility itself. "Your mother understood that flying was a metaphor," Hartwell said, "for freedom, for seeing beyond limitations, for reaching toward something greater than yourself. That's what she did with her life. She flew toward integrity even when it would have been easier to stay grounded." Sarah felt tears on her cheeks. "I wish I could have known her before, when she was still a pilot." "You are knowing her," Hartwell said. "Every choice you make, every time you stand for something difficult, every time you choose to be honest even when it costs you, that's Amanda. That's her legacy continuing, not just in you but in everyone she influenced. In me, in Williams, in every pilot who heard her story and understood that excellence requires integrity." By her second month back at Nellie's, Sarah realized that her status had fundamentally changed. She was no longer the new flight attendant who'd accidentally triggered a security response. She was Sarah Mitchell, daughter of David Mitchell and Amanda Cross, carrier of the Phoenix call sign, bridge between generations, guardian of a legacy that mattered. The pilots began requesting her specifically for their flights, not because she was the best flight attendant, though she was excellent, but because flying with her felt like flying with history. Her presence reminded them of what they were part of, what they were responsible for protecting. And Sarah, for her part, had begun to understand her father's sacrifice and her mother's courage not as sources of resentment, but as gifts. They had given her a life free from the shadows that had consumed their own. They had loved her so profoundly that they'd been willing to lose her to protect her. That understanding transformed everything. The International Women in Aviation Gala took place 6 months after Sarah's first flight with the squadron. It was held at the historic Fairmont Hotel in San Francisco, an elegant ballroom filled with women who had defied gravity in every sense: pilots, engineers, test pilots, academics, and administrators who had all, in their own ways, broken through barriers that had once seemed insurmountable. Sarah arrived in a deep blue evening gown, her hair styled elegantly. Her mother, Mary Mitchell, the woman who had raised her, on her arm. Mary had insisted on coming, understanding with the clarity that comes from decades of marriage to someone with secrets that Sarah needed to know she was loved and supported unconditionally. "Your father would be so proud of you," Mary said as they entered the ballroom. "He always said you had his backbone. I now understand he meant something more specific." Sarah squeezed her hand. "I couldn't have done any of this without you, without both of you. Mom, you have to know that you're my mother. The woman who raised me, who taught me kindness, who showed me what it means to stand by someone through impossible circumstances. That's you." Mary smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. I always knew there was a space in your heart that belonged to someone else, someone you'd never meet. It comforts me now, knowing that space has been filled." They moved through the ballroom together, and Sarah recognized several faces from her time at Nellie's. Colonel Hartwell was there with his wife, Captain Chen with his family, Major Williams looking radiant in a crimson gown. They all greeted Sarah with genuine warmth, no longer as a curiosity or a connection to legend, but as a peer, as someone who had earned her place in their community. Then Amanda arrived. Sarah saw her across the ballroom, the woman who carried her genetic code, the woman she'd learned to know over the past months through conversations and carefully shared histories. Amanda wore a stunning silver gown, her dark hair now completely silver, styled in an elegant updo. She moved through the crowd with the same particular grace that Sarah had inherited, the same way of observing before engaging. When their eyes met, everything else fell away. Mary gently squeezed Sarah's hand. "Go," she said. "You two have things to say to each other." Sarah crossed the ballroom, and Amanda moved to meet her halfway, collapsing the distance between past and present. They embraced, and Sarah noticed that Amanda was trembling slightly. "I'm nervous," Amanda admitted. "Isn't that strange? I'm nervous to be seen with you in public. Not because I'm ashamed, but because I want this moment to be perfect, and I don't know how to make that happen." "This is perfect," Sarah said. "You're here, I'm here, we're together, that's perfect." Amanda introduced Sarah to a group of younger female pilots, women in their 20s and 30s, who represented the new generation of aviation. One of them, Captain Jennifer Hayes, looked at Amanda with obvious admiration. "Dr. Cross has been mentoring me," Captain Hayes explained to Sarah. "She's been instrumental in my development as a pilot. And I have to say, knowing your story, both of yours, it changes how I understand my own path. It makes me realize how much privilege and safety I have because of women like your mother who fought for change." Amanda placed her hand on Sarah's shoulder. "I want to introduce you all to my daughter, Sarah Mitchell. She carries the Phoenix call sign, the same call sign I carried when I was a test pilot. That's not a burden, though some might think it is. That's a connection to something larger than ourselves." As the evening progressed, Sarah found herself in conversation after conversation. Women shared their stories, their struggles, their triumphs. A test pilot spoke about being the first woman in her program. An engineer described designing systems that had made aviation safer for everyone. A commander explained the politics of breaking through glass ceilings and the necessity of bringing others along with you. And throughout all of it, Amanda was present, not as a legend, not as a ghost story from the past, but as a real woman who had made real sacrifices and lived to see the fruits of those sacrifices blossom in unexpected ways. Later, during the award ceremony, Sarah was stunned to be called forward. She received the Distinguished Service Award for exceptional contributions to military aviation and the promotion of aviation excellence through integrity and professionalism. As she held the award, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she'd been an anonymous flight attendant, unaware of her true origins, serving elite pilots without understanding the weight of history she carried. Now, she stood in a ballroom filled with women who had changed the world, and she was being recognized as one of them, not because of who her mother was, but because of who she had become. That night, Sarah and Amanda sat together in a quiet corner of the hotel, away from the crowds. Between them lay the foundation for a relationship that would continue building, day by day, conversation by conversation. "I want you to know something," Amanda said. "When I gave you up, when I walked away from that life, I thought I was making an ending. I thought my contribution to aviation was finished, that I'd failed. But I was wrong. I didn't fail, I just transferred the mission to someone else. To your father, who protected you and ensured you'd have a life of freedom. And now, through you, that mission continues." "What mission?" Sarah asked. "The mission of integrity," Amanda said simply. "Every time you tell the truth when lying would be easier, Every time you speak up when silence would be safer, every time you choose what's right over what's convenient, you're continuing what I started. You're showing the next generation of pilots, the next generation of women, that character matters more than comfort. Sarah reached across and took her mother's hand. And every time I fly with the squadron, every time I serve those pilots, every time I carry that call sign, I'm honoring what you and Dad did. I'm honoring the choices you made for me, even though I didn't understand them at the time. The two women sat together in comfortable silence, watching other guests enjoying the gala. On the stage, a video was being shown celebrating women's contributions to aviation across history. Sarah recognized footage of Amanda Cross from the 1990s, young, confident, brilliant. "Do you regret it?" Sarah asked quietly. "All of it, giving up the career, disappearing, missing my childhood." Amanda considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I regret that the choice had to exist. I regret the system that forced me to choose between my integrity and my family. But do I regret the choice I made? No. Because if I'd chosen differently, you would have grown up in the shadow of a classified investigation. You would have been the daughter of a woman on the run, always looking over your shoulder. Your father gave you something I never could have: safety. And that was the greatest gift either of us could give you." As the evening drew to a close, Captain Hayes approached them again. "I have to tell you both something," she said earnestly. "I'm going into test pilot training. I'm going to do what Dr. Cross did, what you both represent. And I'm doing it partially because of you, because I understand now that being a test pilot isn't just about skill, it's about courage and conscience. Thank you for that." After Captain Hayes left, Amanda looked at Sarah with an expression of such profound pride and love that Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. "The legacy begins," Amanda whispered. "It began with me, it continued through you, and now it's spreading to women like Jennifer who will take it even further. That's how change happens, Sarah. Not in one dramatic moment, but through generations of women standing for what's right, even when it costs everything." Sarah understood then that her journey, from confused flight attendant to carrier of legacy, was not an ending. It was a beginning of something far larger than herself, something that would ripple outward through time and touch lives she would never know. And as she stood in that ballroom with her mother, both mothers, in every sense that mattered, Sarah felt the full weight and wonder of the Phoenix call sign. Not as a burden, but as wings, ready to carry her toward a future she was only beginning to understand.